Hey guys, welcome to the Paladin review of Whispers of the Old Gods. This is for the arena only, and we're going to look at how the Paladin is going to be affected by the new cards and the new arena meta. Paladins, as we know, are the scourge of the arena because they're just flat out overpowered when it comes to their cards, and they're definitely one of the easiest classes to play. And a lot of times how well you do has more to do with your draft and your gameplay, assuming you know the basic principles. So they're a great class for new players, and they're annoying for good players to face because you're just like, oh, mustard, oh, hammer, oh, blessing of kings, seal, you just game ends, right? And that's not exactly the case for most other classes. So, or at least if it's the case for something like Rogue, you're like, all right, well, at least you had to like kind of plan it out a couple turns ahead if you want to do that consistently. In terms of the old gods, what's happening with the Paladin, I think everybody was hoping that the Paladin would get a little worse, even though it was never the actual strongest class in the arena meta. If you look at the top players, I don't think Paladin's like anyone's best class. It's always on the top couple of classes, but it just goes into that whole, like, it has a ceiling, right? If you don't get those great cards, it's really not that good of a class. And so whatever percent chance it takes you to, like, that you have of getting those great cards, well, that's how good Paladin is. So we ranked at number 3 in the arena class tier list, and but it was still a little annoying, and everyone was hoping you'd see a little less Murlocs, you're hoping you'd see a little less Blessing of Kings, a lot less Oldemons. So the bright side is you'll see a few less Oldemons just because of the OOE change. But anyway, let's move on and see how the Paladin will perform. So in the Old Gods meta, one of the key things, because of all the taunts and all the slowness, is that buffs are going to be buffed. That was take 3. I think I got it this time without totally cracking up at the pun. And what I mean by that is that imagine if you're trying to play a game and you're trying to be on the board and you play a taunt. A taunt is most effective when you already know what your opponent has played. So to get the most value out of your taunts, you're okay playing a slightly slower game. In addition, you may try to set up situations where your opponent like has a small minion on the board or something, and then you put a taunt up and it doesn't really matter, right? Your opponent can't clear or, trade into your minion. And so that incentive to kind of leave minions on the board either allows the Paladin to buff their minion and then do the board trading thing, or it forces your opponent to get less value out of their taunts because they're still repeatedly trading into your minions for no good reason. Well, for good reason. But the cost of the reason is tempo. So that's definitely going to help the Paladin. It's one of the classes with the most buffs. I mean, it is the class with the most buffs. It has very powerful buffs. Blessing of Kings, Seal of Champs, just Argent Protectors, right? Hand of Protections, Blessing of Might, which we just raised a ton in our tier list score recently. Blessing of Wisdom, for that matter, right? Like, Paladin's taunt is just Paladin's buff. That's what they do. And the second thing the Old Gods meta has that's going for the Paladin is that the Paladin hero power is really good in the late game. It generates a 1/1 every single turn. So that's one extra thing on the board that your opponent has to clear if they don't want you to buff, or if they don't want you to go face with it, which taunts a lot of face damage. So it's effectively like a taunt as well if you've been aggressive, or if your opponent suspects that you have a buff in your deck somewhere and doesn't want to get screwed. And on top of that, it trades evenly with the best other hero powers for the late game. So it's kind of ridiculous in the late game. And giving that, and so when the late game becomes more of a factor, well, your hero power becomes more of a factor, and the Paladins get a slight buff there. It also just matches up really well against Shaman, Warrior, and Priest. And at least Shaman and Priest are two of the decks that also get better as the game goes later. So Paladin also has a pretty good matchup there. With LOE, one of the things that's going to happen with the Paladin meta is that there will be less Ultimons, which we're all happy about. But Ultimon's still such a big effect that it basically gave Paladins its first real hard removal at the common slot, and that'll still be a concern. You'll still sort of play around Ultimon. And Ultimon itself was always a great card, but it wasn't as good or as devastating as the effect that it caused on how you can play around a Paladin. A good player needs to limit the amount of chances and RNG that they take, right? If you're a player that averages 60% wins, that's good. But that means if you're taking an RNG chance of 65%, it's totally okay for you to take. For a good player, if you're averaging, let's say, 75% wins, well, now you can't take that 65% chance. That becomes bad for you. You can't even take a 70% chance. I mean, you can, but it becomes a negative. So taking the chance, assuming you don't have a very good read, taking the chance that your opponent could play an Ultimon, that in itself is a risk, which is as bad as an RNG event in the sense of, like, from the perspective of the player playing. So in that same exact way, just the existence of Ultimon screws over good players against Paladins. And it's one of the reasons why Paladins get so hated. And it's a game design thing too, right? Like, it comes in and it enters a space where the Paladin wasn't there before. It was one of the only weaknesses of the Paladin. Paladins can't do hard removals. This isn't quite a hard removal, but it nullifies a lot. Like, it has the same scaling thing where it's way better against bigger things than it is against smaller things. So it's entering these spaces that other classes have very well covered, and is getting rid of a weakness of the Paladin. And one of the things that defines a class more than its strengths are its weaknesses, right? Classes are defined by their hero power, by their very top cards, and by the things that they can't do frequently. So that was a design thing that Blizzard did that kind of really screwed over good players in the arena when it comes to facing Paladin. And you'll see this theme come up again later on when I go over the Paladin cards. Because there's another card here that's highly problematic for good players. And it kind of underpins a lot of my concerns about Paladin in terms of class balance in the arena for this expansion. Anyway, on to the new cards. First thing about the new cards is that you see a lot of Divine Shield interactions going on. It's obvious that Blizzard's trying to bring this back into the Paladin deal. They had Seal the last time, and now they're going to get even more onto this Divine Shield train. So we're going to actually go over the rare cards first for Paladin, because they're the Divine Shield cards. First, Steward of Darkshire. Whenever you summon a 1 health minion, give it a Divine Shield. Getting a 1/1 Argent Squire is kind of like getting 2 1/1s. It's not quite as good. So normally, if you're just hero powering, this is not quite as good as a Silverhand Regent. But you can also just play 1 health minions. You won't have a lot of them in your deck, but you can. And 1 health minions also obviously get worse, right? We cover this in the Hunter one. Because later on in the game, the card advantage is gone if it gets pinged. And mages are still popular in the arena, right? Druids exist. Rogues take a little bit of face damage, but they can generally take care of it as well. Paladins, right, even can take care of it. So those are going to be a little less popular, but still, you're going to pick some. And it is still a viable strategy for the Paladin to kind of go token style and go face, because their hero power generates an extra dude, which is an extra target to be hit. It's going to be less viable because of the taunts, but it is still a Paladin kind of like arena archetype that they can do. And next card is Selfless Hero, 1 mana 2/1. How good is it? It death rattles, give a random friendly minion Divine Shield. What else gives random minion, not random, what else gives minions Divine Shields? Argent Protector, which is an insane card. This is even better statted than an Argent Protector for its mana cost, so it should be amazing. It's not amazing. It's not amazing because it gives a random minion, first of all, Divine Shield, and second of all, if your opponent kills it, which they probably will, it gives a Divine Shield onto a minion, and then they get to deal with it on that turn. On the bright side, if your opponent can't really clear your board before pinging it, so it doesn't trigger on anything, then by pinging the 2/1 with a hero power or something, they can't use that same ping on your other minion. So it's definitely not an Argent Protector level good. But depending on how you look at it, it could be better or worse than you think, right? I could definitely see people looking at this and thinking it's amazing. It's not amazing. And I can see people looking at this and thinking, it's all right, but that Divine Shield I'm not going to get much use out of. You'll get more use out of that Divine Shield than you think. So this is a very good one drop. Just to add to the amount of good Paladin cards that exist, especially in the rares. And it obviously synergizes with Steward of Darkshire. The other Divine Shield card is Rallying Blade, another rare, and it's a seemingly innocent 3-mana 3/2 weapon, which are good. Weapons are always good, and this weapon is good. But then the Battle Crisis give +1/+1 to your minions with Divine Shield. You can play it on the same turn as a minion with the Divine Shield. It doesn't eat your Divine Shield like Blood Knight or anything. It just gives +1/+1. So if you can get +1/+1 on one of your minions, potentially even a minion that's already on the board, so essentially has charge, it's very good. If you can't, it's still a good card. So once again, we have another really powerful rare card entering the Paladin meta. Steward of Darkshire, by the way, if you look at it compared to Silverhand Regent, is also a good card, right? So just like a lot of good cards coming in on the rare side. And Paladins don't need good cards. Now, moving on to the common cards, before we move on to the common cards, I want to talk a little bit more about tokens, right? Steward of Darkshire encourages you to generate tokens. Selfless Hero is essentially a token. And this next card, which is a common Paladin card, is a 5 mana, it's Stand Against Darkness. It's 5 mana, you generate 5 tokens. 5/1/1 tokens. Definite synergy with Steward of Darkshire, and also synergizes with the ability to buff something, right? Because it's hard to remove all the tokens. You have to burn a mass removal, which is like a board clear, which is very rare in the arena these days. But I think I made the point in the last review when we first saw this card. 5/1/1s is not as good as a 5/5. It's especially not as good as a 5/5 when your opponent taunts a lot, right? That's like the worst case scenario. Because one of the few things good about splitting up all of your stats, is that your opponent now has to use up attacks in order to clear all of it. And each attack is valuable, and it's not going face, it's not removing another bigger minion. But all those problems are solved, except the buffing one, if you just taunt, right? So the fact that there's a lot of taunts coming in makes this card even worse than what you might think this card is right now. But still, it fits the flavor of the Paladin. I like that. Paladins are the token class. Druids are probably the second token class. Moving on, we are now going to get to the problematic Paladin cards. Like, there's just... I just, like, this is where you just sigh, right? And you're like, Blizzard, come on. We're not talking about a class that is not good in the arena. We're not talking about a class that people aren't already complaining about more often than any other class. Like, why would you do this? Why would you do this, and why would you make these cards common? I guess they kind of had no choice because the rare Paladin cards were so good too. But you're just giving Paladins a lot of good cards. Okay. So the first card I want to talk about is a Light in the Darkness. And you may be thinking, wait, this is not a minion. It's a spell. It's a 2-mana spell. Okay, I'm going to count it as a minion because you draw the minion. And what minion do you draw? You draw a minion, or you discover a minion, and it is heavily weighted. I think it's like 5-1 or something. I forgot the exact discover ratio, but it is heavily weighted towards Paladin class cards. This is the key here, because Paladin class minions are insanely good. They're not just like normal levels of good. They are, I'm not even talking about Tyrians here, but like just think of all the Paladin minions you know. Argent Protector, Tyrion Adric, those are minions. Aldor Peacekeeper is a minion. So what's the worst Paladin minion, class minion? It's Cobalt Guardian, which is really bad. But now what's the second worst? And before we spend all the time trying to think about it, because you're starting to think about bad cards and then you realize you can't think of a bad card, there are none. The next worst card is probably like Guardian of Kings. Guardian of Kings is pretty good. So, especially as a Discover card for the late game. So I don't know. Like maybe it's the horse rider that buffs your dudes or something. But those are all good cards. So your chances of discovering a really good paladin minion is pretty high. So this is a very good card. You may be thinking 2 mana, though it's anti-tempo, right? Sort of. You get your tempo back whenever you play this card. At least one of the tempo you get back. So you're really only spending 1 tempo to kind of discover this card, which matches the Raven Idol situation. And Raven Idol is kind of insanely good. And Druid has a less good minion selection than Paladin. So we're really at the point where an insane card, not like a super overpowered card, but a very, 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 very good card that you will take, like, you would be totally okay taking this instead of a Yeti or something. And it's been added to the Paladin. And I think even more annoying to me is that it's going to just make me see Tyrians and Adrix more. And those are cards that kill you. Like, they flat out change the entire game and kill you and get you. They win you games if you're the Paladin that you have no business winning. And if you're the other player, you lose when you had no business losing. Like, it's kind of the worst kind of card. Like, we all know Discover's a great mechanic, yada yada. But Discover a Paladin minion, maybe eventually Paladins will get some bad minions and it'll balance this card out, but not right now. Right now, the only thing balancing out this card on the Paladin side are all the new minions that are being released. And remember, they're not bad. We just went over that. They're not even bad. Okay, so first card I had a problem with, A Light in the Darkness. Second card I have a problem with is even better than A Light in the Darkness. It is Divine Strength. It is a 1 mana card that is a buff. And we all know buffs are good in this meta. And it says give a minion +1/+2. So this card is OP. I haven't watched anyone's card review yet, so I don't know if I'm the only one who thinks it's OP or if we have different levels of OP-ness thinking. But just stat-wise, this is kind of what it should be. +1/+2 in terms of buffing a minion for 1 mana. It's not overstated or anything, but the implications are ridiculous. This card is Keeper of Oldemon levels of broken. I'm going to repeat that again. This card is Keeper of Oldemon levels of broken. I don't mean it's necessarily going to be rated as high as Keeper of Oldemon, but I'm saying its effect when you are facing a Paladin is going to be very similar to Keeper of Oldemon in that it will completely screw over good players. And it is going to completely change the way the meta works against a Paladin. I wrote an article way back when called Killing Uther that outlines how you kill a Paladin. And it was very structured, because back then in Classic, Paladins had things they could do. They deal 4 damage with True Silver, they deal 3 damage with Hammer, but you don't really care, and they deal 2 damage with Consecration. And they can't do anything else. So make sure they don't Argent Protector their stuff by making sure your stuff has more health, and then keep bigger minions healthy rather than use your big minions to eat the smaller minions, and you're good. It was a way for good players and players who knew the meta to be able to get ahead and crush the Paladin. I had an over 80% win rate against Paladins, and then slowly and slowly Paladins kind of got out of that zone and chipped away at that, right? You had your Seal of Champs, you have your Muster for Battles, you have your just all this other random stuff, cog hammers that just change the math on you. And it made it a lot more difficult to play around the Paladin. And Divine Strength takes this to a whole different level. We raised Blessing of Might over Hand of Protection in the latest tier list update by a lot. But I don't think we changed Hand of Protection. And that's just because you have added tempo onto the board in terms of the attack. And that is so important for Paladin, because you need to keep the board as the Paladin. Blessing of Might essentially is a removal, whereas Hand of Protection is basically summon this minion again. At best, that's if that minion dies. If the minion wouldn't have died, a Hand of Protection or an Argent Protector effect is the same as heal a minion, right? All of a sudden, it doesn't look as OP. Whereas Blessing of Might actually allows you to take control of the board by killing off something that you otherwise couldn't have. Divine Strength is not 3 damage, it's just 1, but it has that same type of effect. It adds an extra thing that you're not really expecting. And it's also why Valen's Chosen is so much better than regular buffs. So I'm going to map this out for you now to show you exactly what I mean. It's turn 2. Your opponent plays a 2-drop. He is a Paladin. You are whatever. You play a 2-drop. Normally, you get your opponent Argent Protectors, and you're screwed, right? That's just how Paladins work. That's always how Paladins worked. But if your opponent goes first, he can't do that. Now, and also, if your opponent plays a 2-3 because he didn't have a 3-2 and you play a 2-3, your opponent can't really do that effectively. Now, this whole thing changes. Your opponent plays any minion on turn 2, even like an understated minion, even like a 2-2, but also potentially a 3-2 or a 2-3. You play any 2-drop. Your opponent plays a Divine Strength and another 2-drop, and your opponent keeps either a 3-attack or 4-attack minion still alive on the board, along with an additional 2-drop. 2-drops, by the way, being better than Argent Protector's 2-2 generally. So, at a mana cost area where you're generally putting down something like 7 mana's worth of stats, your opponent just effectively doubled the amount of stats you can put out on turn 3. And they can do it 100% of the time as long as they have these cards. Even Argent Protector was 75%, because your opponent could play a 2-3 and then you play a 2-3 and it doesn't work. So, if you think Seal of Champs is ruining your expectations game when it comes to the arena against the Paladin, because at turn 3, Paladins are now able to do things, whereas before Paladins couldn't do anything until turn 4. You had this like safe zone to kind of set up, and that was your buffer against the Paladin, because the Paladin got ridiculous after turn 4. And now the Paladins still get ridiculous after turn 4, but they're also pretty ridiculous on turn 3 if they have Seal of Champs. And now with Divine Strength, they're also ridiculous on turn 2 if they have a 1-drop, or on turn 3 if they have a 2-drop, or any turn if they coin out something. Like, Divine Strength ruins the game. Flat out. This is a horribly, horribly designed card when it comes to the arena. I have no idea what the hell it does in the ranked meta. I don't even know if it's a good card. I don't even know if anyone will use it. It doesn't matter. In the arena, this card is going to make you hate Paladins way more than Keeper of Oldemon ever did. It's going to make Paladins so much more RNG based on the matchup of what your opponent gets, having nothing to do with you, and you having no ability to defend or play around it. That's what's frustrating, right? It doesn't matter how good of a player you are. It doesn't even matter what cards you have. You just have no way to play around this. And again, it's bad for flavor. Like, you're thinking, oh, buff, Paladin, that's good flavor. That's not part of the Paladin's flavor to have these small buffs that actually help it gain the board. The Paladin's small buffs don't really help it gain the board. At least not in this way. Their big buffs help it gain the board. There was always this safe zone, and Blizzard is destroying the Paladin's safe zone. Classes need weaknesses. The Paladin's weaknesses are just disappearing one by one in the arena. And so there is no way to play around this class. And worst of all, it's one of the easiest classes to play. So it's just a bad mix of all the factors. Now, if you're wondering where we're going to rate Divine Strength, I'm making this like, if you're listening to me talk, you're like, oh my god, it's like a fire elemental level of good. It's not a fire elemental level of good. Its effect when you're facing a Paladin is insane. But in terms of how good it is, you also have to wonder about what happens if you draw it in the late game. And if you draw it in the late game, it could be like a Hand of Protection, right? Because you do get 1 extra attack, which is good, but you probably take a lot more damage too than a Hand of Protection. And so in the late game, it's not really that much better than a Hand of Protection. But in the early game, it's pretty much one of the best cards that exist in the entire game. So its actual score will be a balance of the two. And that's part of the thing, right? Like, its score is going to be so good, everyone's going to pick it. And then if players draw it early on, they just win the game. And if you're a good player, if you're a bad player, it doesn't matter. It's not like hard to use this card. Anyway, and just to pile on, the name is horrible too. Divine Strength? What happened to the blessings? Blessing of Kings, blessing of whatever. Anyway. Epics. Paladin Epics. now that I've gone on my Paladin rant. Forbidden Healing is a Paladin epic. We've discussed this card. I don't want to talk about it any more than that. It's not that good, but with all Forbidden cards, the fact that it's flexible and can use all of your mana at any time makes it okay. You can also heal a minion, which is kind of what you'll probably use it for, or you can heal your face for 10 and not do anything else that turn. Not good, but better than your normal heals. Valfen Inquisitor, it's a 1-mana 1/3. 1-mana 1/3s are surprisingly decent in the arena right now. I don't know how good they'll be in the Old Gods meta, because 1-drops are just going to not be as good, and you don't want to basically lose a card, right? Like, you play this on turn 5 or 6 or whatever, you have lost a card, and that's going to become a much bigger deal in Whispers of the Old Gods than it is right now. So maybe it was bad before, but not too bad. Maybe it's going to be really bad now. I don't know. Regardless, not something that's going to affect the meta. That's it for the Paladin. Final rank. Let's go with a 7.5 out of 10. I think that's fair, because even Divine Strength is more of a boogeyman than it is actually good. So the overall strength of the Paladin is increasing, but the cards themselves are not necessarily like the absolute best cards. Like, a Light and Darkness may actually be a better card than Divine Strength, but the existence of Divine Strength really just, it's very bad design, I think. So we'll rank it 7.5 out of 10. It got better. That's right, Paladin got better. When Ben Brode, when we were doing the Mage card, Faceless Summoner, and Ben Brode went on halfway stream and said, hey guys, don't panic yet. A lot of other classes are going to get ridiculously overpowered cards. I don't think this is what he had in mind. Maybe it was, but if it was, this should not have. I'm very down on the meta's design right now, because you're going to see a lot of Paladins. You always see a lot of Paladins because, like I said, it's easy to play and it's super powerful, and it doesn't scale as well with skill. So worse players are going to be better with it. And now you're going to see it kind of all of its worst aspects magnified, and one of the few remaining weaknesses of the Paladin that you can kind of plan for disappearing. Just very bad. Just this one class can't ruin a whole meta, but as Paladin has shown in the past, you can sure give it a run for its money. That's it for me for this card review. We're going to do Warlock next. As always, thank you to the Patreons for feeding the goat. That's what makes these videos possible. And Whispers of the Old God meta review continues next.